We all know what is SADC, and I think the SADC treaty is quite clear on what it wants to achieve. Maybe before I actually say that, if you see the topic is the RISDP review, and I'm here only concentrating on one pillar of that RISDP review, which I think is what TRALAC normally is concentrating on as a trade law center, which is trade and economic liberalization pillar. Coming back to the SADC treaty, we all know really that SADC came together in that pillar. They actually agreed, member states of SADC, to develop policies aimed at the progressive elimination of obstacles to the free movement of goods, services, capital, and labor, and the people of the region. So that is almost what summing up what SADC really wants to achieve with this pillar. They want free movement of goods and services and factors of production. That was in 1992, and the RISDP is a plan to operationalize that objective of SADC as expounded in the treaty. The RISDP is a 15-year plan stemming from 2005 to 2018. And maybe one of the purpose of the review is really to see whether is SADC still committed to that idea expounded in the treaty, the free movement of goods, services, capital, and labor, and people. And so the review should find out whether they are still committed, and if they are committed, the approach to achieve that, is it still feasible? Is it still relevant? And now the process is ongoing to find answers to that. And the approach is very clear. And I think we all know that from this pillar. It's really to start with trade liberalization in the form of an FTA, moving on to other deeper levels of integration. And it's important to realize that the FTA has been significantly achieved, despite the fact that not all countries of SADC are party to the FTA. Angola, DRC are not part, and Seychelles is now in the process of negotiating accession to the FTA. We all know customs union is not achieved, and I'm not going to go through the reasons why it's not achieved, but I think we all know, and it should inform the review process. But one could say it's widely acknowledged that this agenda is a bit unrealistic, it's too ambitious and over-optimistic, particularly within the time frame that has been agreed of 18 years. So whether the review will make a conclusive view around this approach is not clear at the moment. But it's also increasingly becoming clear from particular discussions within SADC at member states level that moving into this post-FTA milestones is becoming increasingly challenging. So that is about the approach. And I think in this process, TRALAC and also on us from the SADC Secretariat, we really would like to encourage debate, which is currently taking place at national levels and at regional level on some of these questions I'm posing. It's also important to realize that in 2007, the RISDP was adopted in 2003, starting from 2005 as implementation period. In 2007, Council of SADC realized that the agenda or the programs as defined in the RISDP were quite broader, and they were putting a pressure particularly on resource and capacities available. So they then reprioritized some of it with trade and economic liberalization and infrastructure support, peace and security cooperation, and then other special programs being highlighted as priorities, and trade and economic liberalization and infrastructure support together consuming about 50% of the budget available. Just now, in a sense of the update, the SADC Secretariat conducted a desk assessment of the RISDP, looking at what has been achieved, what are the constraints, what are the challenges. I'm also not going to summarize that. It's easily available on the SADC website, the whole report of the desk assessment of the RISDP. Then a consultancy independently was contracted to undertake an independent midterm review of the RISDP implementation between 2005 and 2012, and they almost visited all member states, talking to various stakeholders, and they also produced a report, which I'm not so sure whether it's publicly available, although member states have it. If you are involved at the national level, you should have probably a copy of that. Then last year, Council then decided that to establish a review task force consisting of the Secretariat, member states, and relevant stakeholders to then look at the desk assessment, the independent review by the consultants, and to come up with a revised RISDP for the remaining period. It's important to understand that this is only for the remaining period. The revised RISDP is only up to 2020. So it's almost like a 4 or 5 year plan now. What will happen thereafter is not necessarily a subject for this review. The review is really looking at the relevance of this agenda of the RISDP, whether it's feasible in the current context, and then resetting of key priorities and identification of what is being called realistic targets. So that is the process at the moment. The final output will only be known in August, but the process is ongoing. Even last week, there was this task force has been meeting at member state level and with some stakeholders for the second time. So I guess this is it's an important opportunity, as Trudy has said, to really inform the regional integration, and what Trudy was also saying, that whether this will respond to the demands of the 21st century is an important debate. Now, I just want to highlight some emerging challenges which are coming out of current discussions, whether from the desk assessment or independent review of the consultants, and now the meetings that took place of the task force that involves also member states and some stakeholders. It's acknowledged that the RISDP scope remains wide. It's very wide. You must understand that economic and trade is just one pillar. There are many other pillars, as I stipulated there in the reprioritization. So it needs to be reprioritized. There is also an overwhelming view that of the ambitiousness and the unrealisticness of the targets. And there is a view that in the current state of overlapping membership of SADC member states in COMESA, in EAC, in SADC, in SACU, such agenda as it's defined is challenged because of the reasons we probably know. And a key issue that is coming out is that whether now let's look at the first statement of what is in the SADC Treaty, free movement of goods, services, labor, and capital. At the moment, we only handled goods. It has only been a trade in goods agenda. Nothing on the other three levels has been really done in terms of free movement of those factors of production. It seems as if, compared to 1992, whoever was there at the launch of SADC and designing the treaty, there seems to be little willingness at member states level to share national sovereignty. There seems to be an emphasis now on policy space, even within what is supposed to be an integrated regional community. So this has to be factored in any thinking, in any new thinking. There is no appetite for regional, supranational decision-making institutions. Secondly, there is very poor implementation of commitments, particularly if we look at the trade protocol, the protocol on finance and investment, and other particular service-related protocol that has been signed and ratified. The implementation is very poor, and often we see some reversal of commitments by member states unilaterally without consulting anybody. And I think we know all those examples. Therefore, there is a debate emerging about how do you make the SADC regional integration process much more rules-based oriented, a process that enhances compliance, and a process that also have an effective dispute settlement mechanism. These things are not necessarily happening, and they affect particularly the approach that is adopted by SADC. We can also come to the second layer of cross-cutting issues, is the inadequate ownership by member states. And I think Professor have highlighted that. The process appears to be not owned by anybody other than probably bureaucrats who are at the regional level. Member states, you look at member states' national policies, there seems to be a disjuncture between what the RISDP is saying and what the policies emerging from member states, particularly of recent developments related to really the free movement of these factors of production that we are talking about. Weak stakeholder participation is a serious problem. And there seems to be no coordination at national levels and between national levels and regional levels, and there is no monitoring and evaluation process in place. So those are some of the emerging cross-cutting constraints or challenges. I just want to say briefly about some priorities that are emerging going forward. There is an overwhelming support that maybe during these 4 years or 5 years of the RISDP, we should focus, or SADC should focus on making the SADC FTA work effectively, dealing with addressing those problems related to non-compliance, dispute settlement, but also making priorities of certain issues like services, customs and trade facilitation, competition, standards and technical regulations, non-tariff barriers. So there is a message emerging there. And I think it's almost like a new thinking, but it's not adequately defined. And I think the challenge is to define that. I'm talking about what Trudy has been saying, whether this FTA is comprehensive enough to deal with the challenges of 21st century trade and production realities. There is also a message that's coming out of almost all member states about tariffs are not so much an issue now. We have reduced tariff, we have eliminated them, but we are not taking advantage of this FTA because productive competitiveness is lacking. So everybody is now talking about the industrial development and having a regional industrial development framework and strategy, and particularly that promotes participation in global value chain as a pathway to industrialization. As also Trudy said, the puzzle is, it's good to say about these things, but how? How are you going to enhance productive competitiveness through a regional industrial strategy? It's not defined clearly. Then there is also a priority emerging of really enhancing financial market integration. We all know that there is a finance and investment protocol, and views that are emerging is that this protocol is almost difficult to implement. It's huge and it tries to cover everything, and nobody knows what are the rights, what are the obligations. Therefore, an implementation strategy is very difficult to distill from that protocol. So the future of this protocol is also an issue to be debated and clarified. I have already talked about retrenching some form of a legal framework that would facilitate implementation, compliance, and resolution of disputes, because that is not happening currently. Other priorities that are emerging, but there seems to be no consensus, and it seems to be a very tricky subject, is on labor mobility. It's a very serious issue, and there are people probably saying maybe by embracing a service agenda, you can then look at how do you facilitate free movement of skilled labor, because unskilled labor seems to be an issue in the region, and professional services. Of course, it's not part of this pillar, but there is a thinking that this economic liberalization and trade pillar must be embedded with functional cooperation related to infrastructure. And there is an infrastructure development master plan adopted. There are also processes that are going on now, establishing a regional development fund, particularly looking at the implementation of the development of the implementation of the development master plan on infrastructure. So that is one of the priority that is emerging. There is a priority that we must enhance institutional capacity for regional integration. It's lacking, whether it's at the regional level, at the level of secretariat, or whether it is at national level, linked also with stakeholder involvement, especially the private sector. The question is how? So this revised plan, to be effective, must answer to these questions. Of course, the revised plan is now taking place under new circumstances where everybody is talking about continental issues, tripartite and continental trade agenda, and maybe this RISDP should be coherent with that, or the review can also be, can have implication on influencing the continental agenda as well. So the big question really is that this thinking, which I have elaborated as possible priorities, in your view and in our view, in tralac view, because I think your annual conference is to really seek opinions from your stakeholders, does this represent a new approach to regional integration in SADC and in Africa in general? And how can it be made to represent that new approach and new thinking? So in conclusion, I just want to say that this is really an opportunity to appraise the approach to SADC on regional integration as tralac is sort of propagating. It constitutes a process of searching for relevance, efficiency, effectiveness, and coherence of these regional integration interventions. The challenge that is emerging is that the involvement of stakeholders remains still very weak in this process. And we have to find reasons why is it weak. I'm not going to say that. But without the involvement of stakeholders, like this conference, its impact, its outcome, and its impact on regional integration development may be limited. So really the message here is, how do we shape this review to be meaningful to what we are talking about? And I think the program then, which we have, my colleagues and the rest of the program, should also take into account that whatever we say, let's probably gather opinion on how we must influence the outcome of this review.